He was Motown's hidden architect, the voice behind the soundtrack of black cinema, and the soul sampled by legends. But while others rose to stardom, his name faded into silence. How did one of music's most gifted minds become a celebrity underrated? This is the untold story of Willie Hutch, the genius the spotlight left behind. His fingerprints are everywhere, from the tender devotion of "I'll Be There" by the Jackson 5 to the gritty funk of the Mack. His words shaped voices, his melodies built movements, his sound carried generations. And yet, most people don't even know he existed. Before the world was bumping to Biggie's bars or vibing to Lil' Kim's verses, they were dancing to Willie Hutch. His music laid the foundation of a culture. His compositions gave power to stories of struggle and survival, and his pen translated pain into poetry. But while his songs became timeless, his own name rarely made the headlines. So how does a man who defined soundtracks, inspired hip-hop, and gave Motown one of its greatest hits vanish from public memory? Why do some artists live forever in lights while others remain echoes in the background? This is not just a biography, it's a reckoning. A reminder that behind every anthem, there's an architect whose story deserves to be told. And today, we tell the story of Willie Hutch. Before the bright lights of Hollywood and the polished halls of Motown, Willie Hutch's journey began far from the spotlight. He was born William McKinley Hutchison on the 6th of December 1944 in Los Angeles, California. But his story truly took shape in the streets of Dallas, Texas. His parents divorced when he was still a child. His mother eventually relocated, and young Willie found himself being raised largely by his grandmother. For many, that kind of fractured home might have bred bitterness. For Willie, it became the soil where music took root. Dallas in the 1,950 seconds was a city in flux. Black neighborhoods were rich with culture but strained under segregation and poverty. For Willie, those streets provided a classroom no school could offer. From the wooden pews of local churches, he soaked in the harmonies of gospel choirs. Out on the corners, he absorbed the smooth, improvised harmonies of doo-wop groups singing under streetlights. It was there, between Sunday sermons and late-night harmonies, that Willie began to understand music not just as entertainment, but as identity, comfort, and truth. He carried that understanding with him to Booker T. Washington High School for the Performing and Visual Arts, a breeding ground for young black talent in Dallas. The school was buzzing with creative ambition, a place where students didn't just dream about music, they lived it daily. It was here that Willie formed his first vocal group, the Ambassadors. But he wasn't just another teenage singer hoping to impress classmates. Even then, Hutch's mind worked differently. He wasn't satisfied with simply singing melodies handed to him. He wanted to craft them. In the Ambassadors, Willie served not only as vocalist but also as the group's songwriter and creative engine. His peers provided voices. He provided vision. He experimented with arrangements, layered harmonies, and lyrics that carried both tenderness and grit. His voice had warmth, but his pen had fire. Friends and teachers began to notice that Hutch wasn't simply another talented student, he was a force shaping his own lane. His influences were as eclectic as his ambitions. From Sam Cooke's silky soul to the intricate harmonies of gospel choirs, from the improvisational freedom of jazz to the raw emotion of street doo-wop, Hutch drew inspiration from everywhere. Yet, unlike many of his peers, he wasn't content to just perform what others had written. He wanted to build music from the inside out. The words, the grooves, the horn lines, the very architecture of sound. By the early 1,960 seconds, Willie had shortened his name professionally to Willie Hutch, a move that signaled both clarity and confidence. His dedication soon caught the attention of Soul City Records, a label founded by Johnny Rivers. In 1964, Hutch released early singles like "Love Has Put Me Down." Though these records never broke nationally, they marked him as an up-and-coming creative mind, especially in the songwriting world. His ability to capture emotion with a handful of words was already evident, and Los Angeles's music circles began to whisper his name. Still, the path wasn't easy. While powerhouse performers dominated radio waves, songwriters often went unnoticed, laboring in the shadows of fame. Hutch spent countless hours writing, arranging, and hustling quietly, developing a reputation in Los Angeles as a man who could deliver tender ballads as well as gritty, streetwise narratives. In an era obsessed with vocal stars, Willie Hutch was carving a space for himself as a quiet mind with loud talent. That persistence would prove critical. Because late one night, as the story goes, the phone would ring a call from Motown that would change everything. But before the world knew him as the pen behind a Jackson 5 anthem or the mastermind of legendary soundtracks, Willie Hutch was simply a young man from Dallas who believed music could carry the weight of love, survival, and truth. And maybe that's why his story matters so much. It wasn't handed to him by industry connections or family wealth. It was forged in hymns, street corner harmonies, and teenage ambition. He was building the foundation of a legacy long before. By the dawn of the 1970 seconds, Willie Hutch had spent nearly a decade sharpening his pen, shaping melodies, and proving that he was more than just another singer hustling for a hit. He had already released a few singles, earned respect in local circles, and shown the industry a versatility that few could match, but recognition remained elusive. Hutch wasn't chasing image, fashion, or gimmicks, he was chasing the... That obsession set the stage for one of the most legendary midnight phone calls in Motown history. It was sometime in 1970 when Hal Davis, a key producer at Motown, found himself in a crisis. The Jackson 5 were preparing to record a new track. The music was strong, the instrumentation lush, but the lyrics weren't working. The session was scheduled, the pressure was on, and Davis needed a miracle. So, in desperation, he called a young songwriter who had been quietly making a name in Los Angeles, Willie Hutch. When the phone rang late that night, most writers would have panicked, but not Hutch. He listened, hung up, and sat down with pen and paper. All through the night, he wrote not from calculation, but from instinct. He dug into the language of longing, devotion, and promise. By dawn, the words were complete, ready. The Jackson 5 would record them, and the world would know the result as "I'll Be There." The song became the Jackson 5's biggest hit and Motown's best-selling single at the time. The vocals soared, the production sparkled, but it was Hutch's lyrics that gave the track its timeless soul. Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, was so impressed that he immediately brought... Overnight, the quiet songwriter from Dallas was transformed into one of Motown's most trusted creative voices. Inside the famed halls of Hitsville, Willie Hutch thrived. But unlike many artists who craved the spotlight, Hutch didn't hunger for center stage. He preferred the work behind the curtain, the space where songs were built, voices were sculpted, and emotions were crafted into sound. His fingerprints appeared everywhere, even if his face did not. One day, he might be arranging strings for Smokey Robinson. The next, he could be writing a gritty groove for Junior Walker. His pen touched Michael Jackson, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, The Miracles, and countless others. What made Hutch invaluable was not just his ability to write lyrics, it was his ability to shape entire sessions. He could arrange vocals, layer instruments, and direct the energy of a recording so that every note served the feeling at its core. In an industry often divided between writers, arrangers, and producers, Hutch was a rare triple threat. He could handle it all. Silky soul? He had it. Hard-edged funk? He could deliver. Romantic ballads? He made them sting with honesty. Protest anthems? He infused them with coded wisdom. His range was staggering. And in the early 1970 seconds, when Motown was transitioning from the polished pop of the 1960 seconds into a more socially conscious and musically daring era, Hutch became the glue that held the sound together. And yet, for all his importance, his name remained largely invisible to the public. He wasn't on the album covers. He wasn't the face on the posters. His contributions lived in liner notes that only true... For Hutch, that invisibility didn't bother him, not at first. He was doing what he loved, crafting music that mattered. Still, a quiet fire was burning inside him. Because while he was helping others shine, he was also imagining a world where his own voice, his own albums, and his own vision could take center stage. The industry, however, had its own way of dealing with talents like Hutch. He was too valuable as a behind-the-scenes magician. Motown leaned on him to steady projects, rescue sessions, and provide songs that stars could make famous. It was rewarding work, but it also kept him tethered in the shadows. And Hutch was beginning to want more. The early 1970 seconds were a turning point. Audiences were hungry for music that spoke not just of romance, but of struggle, survival, and pride. Black cinema was emerging with a new wave of gritty, street-level storytelling. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Hutch's ability to merge orchestral ambition with street-born truth gave him a voice that the culture desperately needed. Soon, opportunities would arrive that allowed him to step out from behind the curtain. Projects where he wouldn't just write the words or arrange the horns, but where he would provide the entire sonic identity. For years, he had built the sound of others. Now he was about to build a legacy because the next chapter of Willie Hutch's story would not be about ghostwriting hits for Motown stars. It would be about soundtracks that defined movements, albums that bared his soul, and an artistry too powerful to stay in the shadows. In 1973, Willie Hutch finally stepped into the spotlight not as a background player, not as a ghostwriter hidden in the liner notes, but as the architect of an entire sound. The opportunity arrived through a raw, unflinching film that would become a cornerstone of black cinema, The Mack. Directed by Michael Campus and starring Max Julian alongside Richard Pryor, the movie told the story of Goldie, a slick-talking hustler fresh out of prison who was determined to reclaim the streets of Oakland. It wasn't a sanitized Hollywood story. It was violent, emotional, and drenched in the harsh realities of urban life. And it needed a soundtrack that could match its soul, something bigger than background music, something that would become the heartbeat of the narrative. Enter Willie Hutch. Unlike many at Motown, who were known for polish and sheen, Hutch brought grit without losing sophistication. He didn't just write songs to play over scenes. He scored the very emotions of the characters, threading their struggles and ambitions into melodies and grooves. The Mack wasn't simply a film with music, it was a film with a pulse. And that pulse was Hutch. The soundtrack opened with Brother's Gonna Work It Out, a track that sounded less like a song and more like a mission statement. Over rolling bass lines, cinematic strings, and gospel-infused vocals, Hutch declared survival, struggle, and hope in a world stacked against black men. It was street wisdom dressed in more than just entertainment. It was a sermon of resilience, a coded anthem for communities battling systemic barriers. Then came Slick, a swaggering instrumental that mirrored Goldie's rise to power. Bold brass sections strutted with confidence, while subtle strings hinted at paranoia and danger lurking in every corner. Hutch's genius was clear. He wasn't just scoring moments, he was scoring personalities. You could hear Goldie's ambition in the horns, his fear in the pauses, his charm in the smooth transitions. Hutch gave dimension to characters without a single line of dialogue. Critics and audiences alike recognized that the soundtrack was something special. Released on Motown, the Mack quickly joined the pantheon of iconic blaxploitation soundtracks, standing proudly alongside Isaac Hayes' Shaft and Curtis Mayfield's Superfly. Yet there was a difference. Hayes and Mayfield became household names. Hutch, despite crafting music every bit as powerful, remained largely unknown outside of dedicated soul and film circles. On the streets, though, it was a different story. Brother's Gonna Work It Out became an underground anthem. You could hear it blasting from barbershops, corner stores, and car stereos. It wasn't just a song, it was a reflection of the hustle, a piece of spiritual fuel for those trying to navigate survival in a rigged system. Over time, hip-hop would resurrect the track, with artists like Public Enemy and Yo Gotti sampling its thunderous energy, cementing Hutch's influence in yet another generation. The Mack soundtrack showcased Willie Hutch at full power. Songwriter, composer, orchestrator, visionary. He proved he could do more than rescue Motown sessions or pen hits for stars. He could define a cultural moment, give sound to a film's soul, and create music that would ripple through decades. And yet, even with this triumph, the industry kept its spotlight elsewhere. Hutch didn't get the magazine covers. He didn't win the awards. His soundtrack sat beside giants, but his name never received equal weight. For some, that might have been enough to break their spirit. But for Hutch, it only lit a fire. Because one success had shown him the truth, he could stand shoulder to shoulder, and soon, he would prove it again. This time with a heroine who redefined strength on screen, Foxy Brown. If the Mack had announced Willie Hutch as a new force in film music, then Foxy Brown solidified him as one of the defining composers of the blaxploitation era. Released in 1974 and starring the incomparable Pam Grier, Foxy Brown was more than just another revenge drama, it was a manifesto wrapped in action, a story of a black woman fighting back against a corrupt, violent world. And once again, Willie Hutch was asked to provide the sound. At the time, blaxploitation films were controversial. Some saw them as perpetuating stereotypes. Others recognized them as vital cultural expressions of black resilience and power. What made Foxy Brown different was its unapologetic focus on a female protagonist who refused to be a victim. For this, the music had to be just as raw, daring, and revolutionary. Hutch understood that instinctively. The centerpiece was Theme of Foxy Brown, a track that married funk with orchestral drama. The bass line pulsed with menace, the strings soared with determination, and Hutch's arrangements gave Pam Grier's character the sonic armor she needed. Listening to it, you didn't just hear a theme, you heard Foxy herself. Bold, sensual, unbreakable. Then there was Give Me Some of That Good Old Love, a soulful, almost tender counterbalance. Here Hutch leaned into romance and sensuality, reminding audiences that beneath the toughness, Foxy was still a woman longing for connection. This duality, strength, and vulnerability was precisely what made Grier's character iconic, and Hutch's music captured it perfectly. What set Hutch apart from his contemporaries was his ability to write music that wasn't background, but commentary. His soundtracks carried social messages coded into grooves and choruses. In Foxy Brown, the funk rhythms and gospel undertones weren't just stylistic choices, they were reflections of the community's heartbeat. The music said, "Here is a story of justice, revenge, and survival that belongs to us." The album itself was a statement. Released on Motown, it found an audience beyond the film, resonating with listeners who may never have stepped into a movie theater. While it didn't soar on Billboard charts the way Hutch's ballads or Jackson 5 hits had, it became a cultural artifact. DJs spun it, record collectors coveted it, and decades later, hip-hop producers mined it for samples. Artists from Nas to Mobb Deep to Lil' Kim pulled pieces of Hutch's grooves, layering his 1,970 seconds vision into the backbone of 1,990 seconds rap. Critically, the soundtrack placed Hutch in the same breath as Isaac Hayes, Shaft, and Curtis Mayfield, Superfly. All three men had shaped cinema with music that transcended mere accompaniment, turning scores into political statements and community anthems. But while Hayes and Mayfield received accolades, Grammy Awards, and household name recognition, Hutch was once again left in the shadows. He was praised, yes, but he wasn't pedestalized. Still, for Willie Hutch, Foxy Brown represented vindication. It proved that the Mack wasn't a one-off success. He had the consistency, the vision, and the artistry to shape entire films through music. He was more than a staff writer or a behind-the-scenes producer. He was a composer whose work defined how audiences experienced black cinema in the 1,970 seconds. And yet, the bittersweet irony remained. As Pam Grier's face graced posters and her name was etched into history, Hutch's contributions slipped quietly into the background. The actors got the close-ups. The studios took the profits. Hutch's genius lived in the grooves of vinyl records, but not in the headlines. By the mid-negative 1,970 seconds, Willie Hutch had accomplished what few could. He'd written a Motown classic, scored two of the most important black films of the decade, and begun a promising solo career. He had the talent and the vision, but he was about to face a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Could a man so versatile, so unwilling to be boxed in, ever receive the recognition he deserved? The answer, as the years unfolded, would prove complicated. After the Mack and Foxy Brown, Willie Hutch seemed poised to break through as a solo artist. The world had heard his pen, his arrangements, his orchestrations. Now, they were about to hear his own voice. And for Hutch, that step wasn't about ego, it was about finally speaking in his own name, telling stories that belonged to him, not just to characters on a screen. In 1973, he released Fully Exposed, his first major solo album on Motown's soul imprint. From the opening notes, it was clear that Hutch wasn't content to follow trends. The record blended funk, gospel-rooted conviction, and cinematic arrangements. Songs like I Wanna Be Where You Are and Can't Get Enough revealed a man unafraid of vulnerability, dissecting love with both tenderness and brutal honesty. Critics respected the work, but the commercial machine didn't know how to market him. The album charted modestly on Billboard's R&B list but failed to break into the mainstream where Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder reigned. He pressed on. In 1974, alongside the Foxy Brown soundtrack, Hutch delivered The Mark of the Beast, a record that experimented with funk grooves and heavier social themes. In 1975, he released Ode to My Lady, leaning into lush romance and silky textures. That same year, he scored a modest chart breakthrough with the single Love Power, which climbed to number 8 on the R&B chart and crossed into the pop top 40. It was proof that he could capture radio audiences when given the chance. But the success was fleeting. By 1976, Concert in Blues showcased Hutch's deep roots in live instrumentation and blues traditions, pouring out pain and longing with raw authenticity. Yet again, critics praised the craft, while the mainstream shrugged. Album after album, Hutch found himself caught in a paradox. Respected by peers, beloved by connoisseurs, but overlooked by a wider audience. Part of the challenge was his refusal to be boxed in. Was he a balladeer like Donny Hathaway? A funk visionary like Bootsy Collins? A soundtrack composer like Isaac Hayes? Truthfully, he was all of them and none of them. His versatility made him invaluable as a behind-the-scenes creator, but difficult for labels to brand as a star. Meanwhile, Motown itself was evolving. The label that had built its empire on polished pop soul of the 1,960 seconds was now navigating disco, funk, and socially conscious R&B. In that transition, Hutch's work was often overshadowed. The machine that had elevated others never fully turned its spotlight on him. It was a cruel irony. The same company that trusted him with its greatest acts and cinematic experiments hesitated to put full weight behind his solo career. He could craft a timeless ballad for someone else, and then watch his own record stall. For Hutch, the recognition he craved seemed always within reach, yet forever slipping. By the late 1,970 seconds, the landscape of black music was shifting fast. The lush orchestrations and romantic ballads that had defined Motown's earlier years were giving way to funk's roar grooves and disco's glittering rhythms. For Willie Hutch, who had always refused to be pigeonholed, this change was both an opportunity and a challenge. In 1978, he joined Whitfield Records, the label founded by former Motown producer Norman Whitfield, a man celebrated for the psychedelic soul of the Temptations. Here, Hutch leaned heavily into funk with the album In Tune. Tracks like Let Me Be the One, Baby, and All-American Funkathon weren't designed to climb radio charts, they were built to shake the floor, to get bodies moving. Hutch was exploring, bending genres, and staying true to his instincts. Yet once again, the industry didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't disco, not exactly soul, not purely funk. He was all of it at once, and that versatility seemed to work against him. By the early 1,980 seconds, Hutch returned to Motown, seeking stability and a renewed platform. In 1982, he released the single In and Out, which found modest success, climbing into the R&B and dance charts and even earning a place on the UK charts. It was a glimpse of commercial recognition, but the breakthrough never fully materialized. Still, the track showed that Hutch could adapt to the sleek production styles of the era without losing his emotional core. A few years later, he contributed music to the cult film The Last Dragon, 1985. Songs like The Glow and Inside You carried his unmistakable stamp. Gospel urgency fused with street. They proved he could still tap into the cultural pulse, scoring not just films of the 1,970 seconds, but also the martial arts meets urban fantasy aesthetic of the mid-80 seconds. Yet even here, his name remained overshadowed by the flashier acts and marketing campaigns of the decade. As the 1,990 seconds unfolded, Hutch found himself further sidelined by an industry chasing polished R&B and the meteoric rise of hip-hop. In 1994, he released The Mack is Back, a nod to the soundtrack that had defined his legend, updated with smoother production but the same soul-driven storytelling. Loyal fans cherished it, but mainstream press and radio barely noticed. In 2002, he returned once more with Sexalicious, proving that even in his 60s, his voice carried the same rasp, warmth, and conviction. But by then, the spotlight had long shifted. The man who had once given Motown its best-selling single and scored 2 cultural landmarks now worked largely in silence. He resettled in Dallas, mentoring younger artists, writing in his home studio, and staying close to family. On the 19th of September 2005, Willie Hutch passed away quietly at the age of 60. There were no major tributes, no Grammy memorials, no grand retrospectives, only a few mentions in trade magazines and among dedicated soul fans. It was a bitter ending for a man who had given so much. Hutch had been too soulful for funk, too funky for pop, too real for radio's formula. He had refused to flatten himself to fit a mold. And in an industry built on packaging and categories, that refusal carried a price. When Willie Hutch passed in 2005, the silence that followed was deafening. No industry-wide tributes, no major award ceremonies, no retrospectives aired on national television. It seemed as if the world had moved on without him. But that silence masked a paradox. While Hutch's name faded from headlines, his music never disappeared. In fact, it became more omnipresent than ever, woven into the DNA of hip-hop, R&B, and even electronic music. His legacy lived on, sampled, remixed, and rediscovered by new generations who may never have known his face but felt his sound. One of the clearest examples came in 2007, 2 years after his death, when UGK and Outkast released International Player's anthem, I Choose You. Built around Hutch's I Choose You from the Mack soundtrack, the song became a massive hit and a defining anthem of Southern hip-hop. For millions of listeners, that lush, aching groove was their first exposure. But in typical fashion, while the track was celebrated as a rap classic, few paused to ask, who was the man behind that sample? This was hardly the first time Hutch's catalog had been mined by hip-hop. Public Enemy tapped into his fiery social grooves, Mobb Deep and Nas borrowed from his cinematic funk, and producers from Dr. Dre to the Chemical Brothers found inspiration in his orchestrations. In barbershops and record stores, crate diggers whispered his name with reverence. To them, Willie Hutch wasn't a forgotten figure, he was royalty, a deep well of soul that never ran dry. What made Hutch's work so ripe for sampling was the very thing that had made it difficult to market in his own time, its richness. His records weren't just songs, they were layered experiences. Strings, horns, choirs, bass lines, rhythms they could be stripped apart, looped, and repurposed into entirely new creations. Each layer carried a single bar of a Hutch track could fuel an entire hip-hop anthem. Beyond hip-hop, his influence stretched into R&B and neo-soul. The smooth yet streetwise tone he pioneered in the 1,970 seconds anticipated the aesthetic of artists like D'Angelo, Erykah Badu, and Maxwell. His blend of gospel warmth, orchestral sweep, and raw honesty echoed through the soul revival movements of the 1,990 seconds and 2,000 seconds. Even when his name wasn't mentioned, and yet, outside of niche communities, Hutch's contributions remained largely unrecognized. Unlike Isaac Hayes, who won an Oscar for Shaft, or Curtis Mayfield, whose Superfly made him a cultural icon, Hutch never received the same pedestal. His credits were often buried in liner notes or missing entirely. The cruel irony was that his work was everywhere on movie soundtracks, in chart-topping rap singles, in the DNA of neo-soul, yet his name was nowhere. He became both but for those who truly knew, the story was different. Among musicians, producers, and die-hard fans, Hutch's reputation has only grown since his death. His albums, once overlooked, have become prized by collectors. Reissues of the Mack and Foxy Brown soundtracks introduced his artistry to younger listeners. And on platforms like YouTube and streaming services, his songs have found new life, reaching audiences far beyond the Motown era. More importantly, his music continues to carry the messages that defined him. Brothers Gonna Work It Out still resonates as a hymn of resilience in communities facing hardship. Theme of Foxy Brown still inspires conversations about Black women's strength and representation. I'll Be There still stands as one of the most tender declarations of devotion in Motown's history. Hutch's music was never just about sound, it was about survival, love, empowerment, and truth. In many ways, Willie Hutch embodies the very idea of an underrated celebrity. He was the architect whose blueprints shaped entire genres, but who rarely received credit for the buildings he helped construct. He was everywhere in sound, nowhere in fame, yet perhaps that invisibility says as much about the industry as it does about Hutch. In a system that prioritizes image over substance, flash over foundation, the quiet geniuses are, but forgetting is not inevitable. Every time a hip-hop producer digs into his catalog, every time a fan shares a Hutch track on social media, every time someone presses play on the Mack or Foxy Brown, his legacy is revived. The industry may have neglected him, but listeners don't have to. Willie Hutch didn't need a Grammy tribute to prove his worth. His songs have already outlived the charts, outlived the trends, and outlived the silence that tried. His echoes are still here, playing through speakers, shaking dance floors, and telling stories of struggle and survival to anyone who listens closely enough. We began this journey with a question: how can a man who shaped the sound of an era vanish into silence? The story of Willie Hutch is the story of that silence. He was the architect behind Motown's timeless devotion, the composer who gave blaxploitation films their heartbeat, the visionary whose grooves became the backbone of hip-hop. And yet, when the lights dimmed, his name rarely appeared on the marquee. It is one of music's cruelest ironies. Hutch was everywhere in sound, but nowhere in fame. His peers, Isaac Hayes, Curtis Mayfield, were celebrated with awards and magazine covers. Hutch was celebrated in whispers, in liner notes, in samples dug up by crate diggers decades later. His genius lived not in headlines, but in echoes. But echoes have power. Listen closely and you'll still hear him. In I'll Be There, where a young Michael Jackson sings words Hutch wrote overnight. In the righteous groove of Brother's Gonna Work It Out, still sampled by hip-hop producers. In the fierce swagger of Theme of Foxy Brown, a soundtrack to resilience and defiance. His music continues to live because it was never about trends or charts. It was about truth. So what do we owe Willie Hutch? We owe him our recognition. We owe him because the industry may forget its architects, but we, the listeners, do not have to. Was Willie Hutch as vital as Hayes and Mayfield? Should his name stand beside theirs in the halls of music history? That's for us to decide. But if you've ever moved to a beat built on survival, love, and fire, then you've already heard his voice. And that voice, raspy, warm, and eternal, will never fade.